All right, folks, welcome to what is probably the thing that most businesses care about is cloud economics. And then the people who are about billing, well, they're usually more the folks that have to execute paying for these things. But if you don't understand how the billing works, you don't understand how the cloud economics works, it's going to be really difficult to justify getting the permission you need to build your cloud infrastructure away from your on-prem infrastructure, or if you're looking to build a new service, how can you get permission from your organization to do such? Cloud economics are definitely going to help you in that quick, easy, I don't have to buy a lot of equipment and worry about getting it installed. So that part's a no-brainer. Like the whole build it when you need it, only use how much you want with some clicks, that's definitely going to be beneficial. But being able to articulate more about how much you're going to be saving and then how the billing kind of occurs and what your options are, it really kind of matters when it comes to the implementation phase. So let's go ahead and get on with these slides. So what are we going to talk about here? What we're going to do is we're going to go through some pricing philosophy things related to Amazon. And again, your different vendors have different philosophies, but they more than likely follow a lot of what Amazon does. Some of the smaller cloud vendors like DigitalOcean and Linode, they're much more focused on individual or small organizations, and they have different pricing philosophies. We're talking big organizations, big infrastructure. What's that pricing philosophy kind of across industries? We're going to identify some fundamental pricing characteristics and the elements of total cost of ownership. Definitely good to go through a total cost of ownership calculation. And in the case of this example, I will discuss, how you as a manager can be skeptical when someone comes with a TCO set of calculations and they don't understand the assumptions. And then also bring up something called this AWS pricing calculator, finishing it up with an example of TCO in a real world implementation. Okay, so first, fundamentals of pricing. The three fundamentals of drivers of cost with AWS are compute, storage, and outbound data transfer. So if you remember, we have these, you'll see these themes throughout a lot of what AWS is talking about. Compute, storage, big things, right? Then you have security. Well, that's not in this particular case, but you do have data and data transfer. And notice that it's outbound data transfer in this case. In most cases, there's no charge for inbound data transfer or for data transfer between AWS services within the same region. But it really does depend on your infrastructure and what that means. Now, there are some exceptions, so be sure to verify your data transfer rates before you begin to use an AWS service, especially for production level stuff. Outbound data transfer is aggregated across services and then charged to the outbound data transfer rate. And this charge will appear on monthly statements as AWS data transfer out, but again, it's across your services, aggregated. So compute usually charged in hours or seconds of amount of compute you do, and it varies by the different instance types. And you notice here it says charge by hour/seconds, Linux only. It really does depend on what type of operating system you're using for your EC2, for instance. And if you're using other services, it may be abstracted to whether or not Linux is the operating system, doesn't even matter. For storage, yeah, you're typically being charged by gigabyte, which sounds like a lot, and the prices are relatively cheap per gigabyte. But when you end up with enterprise scale and you're talking many thousands of terabytes and petabytes of data, the storage cost can go up. So how do you pay for AWS? This is the philosophy that underlies AWS pricing. While the number and types of services offered by AWS have increased dramatically, we're talking many hundreds, the philosophy on AWS pricing has not changed. At the end of each month, you pay for what you use. That's a good thing. You can start or stop using a product at any time, and there are no long-term contracts required. Doesn't mean that contracts can't save you money, but we'll get to that in a second. So AWS offers a range of cloud computing services, as we previously shown, and way more than we did show. Okay. For each service, you pay for exactly the amount of resources that you need and use, depending on how you set it up. The utility style pricing model includes one, pay for what you use. Okay. Then there's pay less when you reserve certain capacity, and then you pay less when you use more. So it doesn't mean that, hey, I used more storage, I pay less. No, what it means is up to a certain amount of storage, let's say, you pay a set price, and then after that set price you keep growing, well, you'll pay more per gigabyte as you go forward. And then you pay even less overall as AWS grows. You don't have any control of that. You have control of what this is. Pay for what you use, pay less when you reserve, if you are able to compute what that reserve capacity is. And then you also pay less and more as your use grows and as AWS grows. You can control how much you grow, but not how much AWS grows. So we're going to take a closer look at these core concepts of pricing. There's also a white paper link for AWS pricing. Very beneficial if you in a future internship or job are going to be doing anything related to AWS. Go find the latest AWS pricing white paper and review it, because it will be very informative and help you drive better decisions. Okay, so pay for what you use. Unless you build data centers for a living, and none of us will, you might have spent too much time and money building them. With AWS, you only pay for the services you consume, no large upfront costs. That's the whole thing of the cloud, right? I want to get what I want when I want it, and I don't want to have to spend a lot of CapEx upfront. So you can lower your variable costs, so you no longer need to dedicate valuable resources to building costly infrastructure, including purchasing servers, software licenses, leasing facilities, etc. So we like variable costs when those variable costs are within the parameters that we expect, use less, pay less, that kind of stuff. So quickly adapt to changing business needs and redirect your focus to innovation and invention by paying only for what you use for as long as you need it and use it. All AWS services are available on demand, require no long-term contracts, and have no complex licensing dependencies. Obviously, this is all straight from AWS. Sounds a little bit sales pitchy, but it is true. You pay for what you use. There's no large upfront expenses, although there are options for you to spend some money upfront and reserve instances. Not even upfront. Spend some money that you're going to spend on a monthly basis that increases your overall monthly bill, but you're reserving capacity. So think about it. It's analogous to, hey, I am going to buy tickets to the theater. Obviously, you're going to pay more if you reserve more seats, that kind of thing. Okay. All right. So let's talk about this pay less when you reserve model. Very useful for certain organizations, depending on how much you understand about what you're going to use. So for certain services like Amazon EC2, which is Elastic Compute, again, this is like getting your software version of a server, and also Amazon Relational Data Services. You can invest in reserve capacity. So RIs is what you'll normally see them as. The acronyms are up there on the screen. For reserve instances, you can save up to 75% over equivalent on-demand capacity. So reserve instances are available in three options. You have all upfront reserve instances. So like, hey, I want this much compute. I'm going to pay for this much. AURI. It's the largest discount, but you're basically telling Amazon, I want to reserve this much compute no matter how much I use. And then if I use more, I can scale up. I'm not going to be able to scale down below what my reserved upfront is. Then you have the partial upfront reserve instances, PURI, where you get a little bit less of a discount, but you're not reserving perhaps as much services that you're going to use. So therefore, if you fall below a certain line, like if you're not going to use everything that you reserve for your all upfront, maybe you can have a lower cut line on that, and you pay less for having that reserved instances, and then you pay more for what you pay as you go. And then there's the model that is kind of what everyone thinks about when they think about the cloud at first, is the no upfront payments reserved instance. You get a smaller discount compared to your on-demand, and your on-demand is literally like, I use it, I pay for it. And if you think about this, really what it comes down to is, okay, I'm going to do on demand. I'm going to pay X amount per compute, X amount for storage, X amount for data transfer. However, if you're going to say, I guarantee I'm going to use certain amounts, it's kind of like guaranteeing to a vendor, let's say they are providing food services. Well, hey, I'm going to guarantee 100 people, and they can budget it and give you a lower rate per plate. But if you're like, I don't know how many it's going to be, we're just going to have a food truck come out front, obviously you're going to pay more per plate, because they don't know how to judge how much they're going to have to be able to prepare, okay? When you use reserve capacity, your organization can minimize risks more predictably manage budgets, and comply with policies that require long-term commitments. So if you're in that category using reserve instances, really good deal. So with AWS, you get volume-based discounts, and that can lead to important savings as your usage increases. For services like AWS S3 buckets, simple storage service, pricing is tiered, which means you pay less per gigabyte when you use more. And that's what I was talking about earlier. If you're only going to use 500 gigabytes or less, you might pay a certain amount. But if you're going to use many terabytes, you'll probably pay less per gigabyte because they expect you to buy more services. And additionally, data transfer is always in for free. So multiple storage services deliver lower storage costs based upon your needs. And as a result, your AWS usage needs increase. You benefit from the economy of scales that allow you to increase adoption and keep costs under control. Okay, so as your organization evolves, AWS also gives you options to acquire services that helps you address your business needs. Like, for example, AWS Storage Solution Portfolio offers options to help you lower pricing based on how frequently you access the data and the performance that you need to retrieve it. So it's not all just one way and that's it. You have different service levels that you can save money on depending on what you're going to use on a regular basis. So to optimize your savings, you can choose the right combination of storage solutions that help you reduce costs while preserving performance at the level that you expect, and definitely security and durability. So savings as usage increases, tiered services based upon what you need for the different storage services like S3, EBS, and EFS. Again, fundamentally, the more you use, the less you pay per gigabyte, and as you move on. And then you pay even more as AWS grows. I'm not exactly sure what you're going to get out of this, but the bottom line is if AWS grows, they'll make their technology cheaper and you may pay less. So I think the expectation here is, hey, the more usage you use and the more AWS grows, the more you benefit from it. Well, okay. But you really don't control how much AWS grows. You just have to roll with it and keep your eyes on how much items cost, whether it's compute, data, storage, transfer, or whatever. Then there's custom pricing. AWS realizes every customer has different needs. So there's a big difference between you being a small company and you being like Dropbox or something like that has an enormous amount of storage and transfer needs. So if none of the AWS pricing models work for your project, custom pricing is available for high volume projects with unique requirements. So if you're one of those like Silicon Valley unicorns, or if you're growing to a state where you have a lot of data needs and hopefully supporting income, you can talk to AWS and get some really good deals for high volume products. Then there's this thing called AWS free tiers. So a really awesome benefit to help new AWS customers get started in the cloud. You want to remove the roadblocks to adoption. That's the whole freemium model, if you want to call it that way. Well, AWS offers a free usage tier called AWS Free Tier for new customers up to 1 year. Okay, not forever. The AWS Free Tier applies to certain services and options, and they happen to be some of the most popular options that companies will use to at least get used to using the cloud as part of their cloud adoption framework and moving from on-prem to the cloud. So if you're a new AWS customer, you can run free EC2 instance for a year while also using a free usage tier of Amazon S3 for storage and EBS for storage. And also elastic load balancing. As you can imagine, if you don't know what load balancing is, again, you have services. You don't want to tax just a single set of servers. A load balancer can divert the amount of incoming requests to go to a variety of the same type of services so that you don't overload one of them. And of course you have AWS data transfer and other services will come with the free tier. There's a link in the slides so you can sign up for a free AWS account. You can learn with like 10-minute tutorials and start building with AWS right away. Really, really great for those of you that are looking to, hey, I'm going to go apply maybe for an internship or a new job at someone who does AWS stuff. Look to see, or use the AWS services, get your free account. Look to see if you can learn some things. And then when you go into it, you go, hey, I'm not an expert, but I have experienced some AWS building, and I experienced how data is used in some projects and classes or on my own. It'll really give you a distinct advantage over others. So what services are not charged overall for AWS with your free account. There's a bunch of stuff. You look in the slide for more details. Key thing, you have this virtual private cloud, enables you to provision a logically in the cloud isolated section of AWS where you can launch AWS resources and not worried about everyone else on the internet being able to see it. There's security with your AWS identity and access management, a whole bunch of other services. And there's no fee for these services. There might be charges based upon what other services you're using. For example, you can automatically scale EC2 instances, but there will be charges for scaling those EC2 instances. Okay, and there's documentation on what is free and what isn't on AWS website. What's the real important part here? There are certain services that are fundamental to AWS for you to be able to use it, and you're not going to be charged, like a Amazon Virtual Private Cloud. Before you can build services that are actually going to be useful for your company, you need to have that network playground, if you want to call it that, to be used for you to start setting things up. Amazon's not going to charge you to use that or auto scaling or access management just because you need those things to be able to function. However, when you get to the services of compute, data storage, and data transfer, and you're fully developed, that's when you start paying for the services. Hopefully that's clear. And key takeaway, there's no charge with some exceptions for inbound data transfer. However, data transfer between services within this same AWS region, usually no charge, but you have to make sure what you're using is free or not. In summary, overall, the number and service of types of services offered by AWS have increased to the point where we cannot even talk about them in a short period of time. That's why there's plenty of documentation online. At the end of each month, you'll pay for only what you use, and you can start or stop using a product at any time. No long-term contracts are required. The best way to estimate costs is to examine the characteristics of each service that you're going to use, estimate your usage for each of those, and then map out that usage to prices that are posted on AWS. The service pricing strategy gives you flexibility to choose the services you need for each project and pay only for what you use. Yes, there are some free services that discussed on the previous slide. While the services themselves are free, the resources they provision might not be free. So what do you mean by that? Again, virtual private cloud. Hey, I've got this network sandboxed environment I'm going to build my services in. When you add more services, the VPC doesn't get charged, but the services will. There are some exceptions, so make sure your data transfer within a zone or not is covered. And again, when you reserve instances, like you reserve number of seats at your wedding or something like that, you will get discounts, but you have to do some planning associated with that. Okay, on to the next section, which is total cost of ownership. Very important section that builds upon all of the things we just talked about here.